final panel of the day. It's my great pleasure to hand over this to our moderator, Reema Hamdieh, who formerly worked at RT Arabic, now is the Washington correspondent for Alaraby television, where she brings in a number of distinguished Washington insiders, plus some media lowlifes such as myself. And she is going to moderate this panel with four people who, I've worked with to a greater or lesser degree, but all of whom I regard as friendly acquaintances, if not actual friends. So, Reema, you've got a fantastic panel, and let me hand it over to you.
Well, I guess we can all agree there's a lot of tension in the Middle East. And this tension is basically, a lot of it comes from the rivalry between Israel and Iran. This rivalry is only intensifying. The regional power struggle is, you can feel it across the Middle East, shaking up the whole Middle East really, from Iraq to Lebanon to Yemen. And while Washington is trying alongside Qatar, Egypt, Jordan, to contain this conflict in Gaza, we can all feel that the rivalry continues to unfold in multiple theaters and in multiple ways. In Iraq, we've seen the Iran-backed militias launching attacks. In Lebanon, we've seen in Lebanon the ground invasion of Israel, the constant continued bombardment of different parts of Lebanon. This has led to the displacement of 1.2 people in Lebanon, Lebanese and Syrians, but also Israel had managed to eliminate the leadership of Hezbollah, Iran's most powerful proxy in the region. Yemen also has emerged to be a regional player in this conflict, with Houthis launching attacks, but also undermining the security of maritime in the region. Our distinguished panel will discuss all of this. The Middle East has never been easy, but now I feel like the Middle East is at the brink of regional war, if it's not already, as some would argue. And let me just remind everybody, and I think everybody has been reminded for like 10 times, that you do have the cards if you have any questions at the end of the 2 rounds of questions. And let me first introduce our very distinguished panel, Dr. Abu Bakr Al-Qirbi, former Minister of Foreign Affairs for the Republic of Yemen, member of the Advisory Board, Gulf International Forum, Dr. Lina Khatib, Director, SOAS, Middle East Institute, David Schenker, Taube, Senior Fellow and Director of Linda and Tony Rubin Program on Arab Politics, Washington Institute for Near East Policy. We also have Dr. Trita Parsi, Executive Vice President, the Quincy Institute, Dr. Abbas, Director of Iraq Initiative and Senior Fellow of the Middle East Program, the Atlantic Council. I promise you all it's going to be very interesting. And with that, I'm going to start with Dr. Qirbi, and I do hope he can hear us now. Doctor, how did the Iran-Israel rivalry, do you think, drove Iran into a broader regional conflict?
Good afternoon to all of you in Washington. I am talking to you from Muscat. And Muscat, as you all know, has played an important role in mediating and setting the venues for meetings between Ansarullah and many other delegates, special envoys, American envoy. And therefore, we are in Muscat today are really very concerned about the recent developments in the Middle East overall, and especially its effect on the peace process in Yemen. Especially now, as you have been, those of you who have heard the special envoy briefing to the United Nations Security Council a few days ago, and he was really concerned about the developments, not only as far as the peace process, but of the possibility of the escalation of the conflict in the region as a whole. And Yemen is certainly now is a target for this escalation. The other thing, of course, is the many comments we have been hearing from the American officials and the change of tone, really, in the way they have been talking to the Ansar Allah in the last few years. And this is obviously is a reflection of the events, as you have said, the consequence of the Ansar Allah targeting the marine ships in the southern Red Sea. Also, more concerning really is yesterday's bombing by B-2 airplanes of Yemen by the Americans. And finally, I think the realization of the rhetoric that is also we are hearing now from the internationally recognized government about liberating the areas that are under the control of Ansar Allah at the moment. So the overall picture for Yemen is really very gloomy. If no really serious attention is given to resolve the conflict. But can we resolve the conflict under the existing conditions? I think it is very difficult. It's very difficult, and therefore, the way I think we have to deal with the situation in Yemen now is to have to see how we can get those who are close to Ansar Allah to persuade them, like Oman, for example, to persuade them to end their interference with the marine lines in the southern Red Sea. Because this is, I think, the condition the United States of America is putting to the Ansar Allah, that unless they do that, they will not be left to run havoc with the situation in the southern Red Sea. Ansar Allah look at this really as a challenge for them. Not only that, because their intervention in the Red Sea have given them great popularity in the Arab and the Muslim world, because it is the only country in the region that has took a position in support of the Palestinians in Gaza, and now they threaten that they will also support the Hezbollah in Lebanon. This complicates the situation for the Yemenis, where there is enormous humanitarian problems in all aspects of the lives of the Yemenis. And the escalation of the war in Yemen is only going to prolong this tragedy that is faced by most Yemenis. So it is hoped really now that this escalation of the situation can be put under control. Whether the American bombing and the British previously will have an effect on Ansar Allah to moderate and change their position is impossible to say or to predict. And therefore, I think we have to wait and see what is the outcome of this situation. So basically, I think the solution of the situation of the conflict in Gaza and Lebanon now is of paramount importance for us as Yemenis, because unless this happens, I think it's unlikely that the Yemen will be targeted by the Americans and the British and maybe others for the sake of protecting the maritime shipping. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Lina, Lebanon is not far from this conflict. It's in the middle of it. But how has the Iran-Israel conflict shaped Lebanon's political and security landscape over the past decade leading up to this escalation?
Gosh, the past decade. It's not just the past decade. I mean, it's very simple and complicated at once. Security and stability in Lebanon are dependent on two regional issues, one being the Israel-Palestine conflict and the other one being Iran's regional interventions in the Middle East at large. And unless these two issues are resolved through a comprehensive strategy that looks at the interconnectedness of those two issues, Lebanon will never be stable. So it's very simple.
It's not, but it is, I guess. Well, can you elaborate more about this? You do bring in the whole Israel-Palestine conflict, and given what's going on right now and the part that Iran is playing, how is it shaping today's political security landscape of Lebanon?
Okay, So, in a nutshell, I look at Washington and I see, since the days of the Obama administration in particular, compartmentalization when it comes to Iran. The prioritization has been the nuclear issue. There has been almost complete disregard for Iran's regional interventions, and this has continued across the administrations that have been in Washington since the first administration of Obama. So even President Trump's so-called maximum pressure on Iran wasn't really maximum pressure, because if it was maximum, we wouldn't be here today. And so I think what needs to happen is a diplomatic reset in Washington regarding handling Iran, because this kind of dynamic that began for me in 2008 is what allowed Iran to expand its influence in the region. And Lebanon is very much part of this picture. And this is how Hezbollah managed to continue growing to become Lebanon's most powerful political actor. And the reason why it became this political actor that no one else can contest is, to a large extent, because it has weapons when no other political actor in Lebanon has weapons, and it has used these weapons to intimidate the political opponents inside Lebanon. And Iran has always been kind of supportive of Hezbollah in this regard. So again, you can see you can't really isolate the domestic situation in Lebanon and say this is separate from the regional and international dynamics. Lebanon has, sadly, almost always been a microcosm of international and regional dynamics, in addition to a very complicated domestic picture. So this is partly why we are here today with Hezbollah just deciding on October 8 to launch missiles on Israel without any authorization from the Lebanese state, because Hezbollah does not act through authorization from the Lebanese state. It's a group that has captured the Lebanese state, takes decisions independently of the Lebanese state, drags Lebanon into war, even though the majority of the Lebanese population does not want that. And so, so this is where we are today. And I think, had US foreign policy addressed Iran's role 15 years ago, it would not have grown to the extent that it has today. Now, the silver lining is, I think we're now turning a corner in terms of Iran's regional interventions. I think its influence has already peaked and is now waning. I think Iran is facing a lot of vulnerabilities. So now is a good time, I think, for the international community, led by Washington, to activate this diplomatic reset. But that will be a long process, and it requires regional allies to be involved in a very meaningful way. So there is a way out. It's not all doom and gloom, but the situation right now, I think, is critical.
And it's an election year, so probably that's a long shot. But Mr. Schenker, what do you believe is Israel's strategic end game in its ongoing conflict with Iran, as well as its engagements on multiple fronts in Yemen, Gaza, Lebanon, elsewhere?
Well, first of all, it's good to be with you today. Thank you for having me. So Israel has a number of strategic interests, but I think primarily among them is that it wants to survive and not be attacked by Iran, by Iran's regional proxies. It has a war in Gaza, and I think, there's a demographic in Israel. There's a disagreement about Palestinian statehood, no Palestinian statehood. There's not a disagreement anymore. 70% of Israelis say no to Palestinian statehood. That could change over time, depending on what happens the day after in Gaza. But I think the strategic interest, they were attacked. They're going to prevent Hamas from ruling Gaza. They hope that the PA can maintain itself and that the West Bank will not be taken over by Gaza. I think the broad international view in any event is that if Israel was not occupying the West Bank, that would be taken over by Hamas as well. But the objective in Lebanon, after being attacked, Hezbollah wanted to engage in a prolonged war of attrition with Israel in support of Hamas, Israel didn't agree. And so they had decided that in order to return the 60 to 70,000 Israelis who have been internally displaced because of Hezbollah, that they will take on what has become an intolerable threat and a strategic threat. I think they always saw Hezbollah in that light. But after October 7th, I think they're no longer prepared to tolerate a Hezbollah that is stationed on the border with essentially the same war plan as Hamas executed on October 7th. So they're going to tackle that, and they seem to be doing pretty well in degrading Hezbollah right now. On Iran, the fundamental question is whether Iran becomes a nuclear power, because Iran has already stated that Israel is a one-bomb state and that Israel must be eradicated. So I think that too is a challenge that Israel likely cannot handle by itself, and perhaps is not handled best militarily. But this is more of an international issue given the nature of the regime in Tehran. So yeah, I think when it comes to the strategic overview, I think Israel views itself right now in the middle of a 7-front war that is all being controlled by Iran. And so they're looking not only to set back the proxies, but also are going to defend themselves against Iran.
Dr. Parsi, with all of that, how has the weakening of Hezbollah within what is known as the axis of resistance impacted Iran's stance on escalation tensions with Israel?
Thank you. It's a great pleasure to be here with all of you and to be on this panel. The way you phrased the question is their position on escalation. I don't know if the premise of that is entirely correct. What we have seen since October 7th is not an effort in which the Iranians are the ones that are at every turn escalating the conflict. And this has also been recognized by the Biden administration. Rather, you have a situation in which the Israelis have seen opportunities, particularly after some of their intelligence successes, to expand the war. They've seen an opportunity to restore a balance in the region that they believe is much more favorable towards them, and to drag the United States into that conflict, something that Netanyahu himself has been seeking for quite some time. But the best opportunity for him to do so appears to be right now, because he has the most pliant president in American history in terms of going along with whatever the Israelis want. So in that context, I don't think it's the Iranians that have been seeking an escalation. The Iranians certainly have supported Hamas, the Houthis and others. This is not a pacifist state in any way, shape, or form. It is one of the most interventionist states in the region. However, not the only one. And since 2015, they've actually been surpassed by other countries in terms of the number of interventions that they've done in the region. What I think is critical in all of this is the degree to which we move towards some sort of a very simplistic analysis of thinking that all of the problems in the region is because of one state. This is the type of reasoning that also led us into the Iraq War. These were the arguments that were being put forward in the early 2000s. All we need to do is take out Saddam Hussein and everything else will be fixed in the region. And here we are, a much more destabilized region than we had 25 or so years ago. Reality is a rivalry between Iran and Israel is in and of itself not an unnatural thing. Rivalries will always exist. The question is, will they take place within the context and a framework that constrains the rivalry, ensures that it doesn't become entirely unstable and destabilizing? Or will it be in the context that we have today? We have zero security architecture for the region. The extent to which there is functioning diplomacy within the region is very limited. From almost all sides, there is a strong zero-sum thinking and a narrative that essentially says, well, if you just eliminate that element, everything will be fine. This goes from both ways. And that type of a mindset and that type of a temperament is certainly going to see the region move in towards even greater instability. I would like to commend what I saw the Iraqi government do with the Baghdad dialogue a couple of years ago, which I was really hoping would have gotten more support than it did, in which they tried to bring all of the countries in the region into a dialogue, an inclusive dialogue that was not targeting anyone. Unlike the Abraham Accords or other efforts, all different variations of trying to see how do we organize the region against this or that state. The Baghdad dialogue was actually inclusive. It was coming from the region itself, unlike what Lina was suggesting that Washington should take the lead. It actually was leadership from the region taking responsibility for their own security rather than constantly looking towards Washington, for some reason thinking Washington can fix the problems in the Middle East. Just take a look at the United States and tell me why you think that Washington is capable of being able to fix problems thousands of miles away, particularly after the track record of Iraq and Afghanistan. I feel not terribly optimistic right now that that approach can continue or that that approach can be revived. But that was the moment, that was the light that I think could have made a significant difference, which would have moved us into a situation in which, first of all, the rivalries that do exist, whether it's between Saudi and Iran, Iran or Israel or other states, would be able to be contained, constrained, and limited, just as much as the rivalries in Europe continued after 1945, but they were put in a completely different framework and prevented from being able to be completely destabilizing. Secondly, within that, move towards norms in which the kind of conduct that we have seen, not only from Iran, but certainly from Iran, but also from other states, in which avenues of influence have been pursued outside of state-to-state interaction, investing in militant groups left and right, which are undermining the authority of the states, weakening the states, bringing many countries closer towards a failed state scenario. All of those things have to move in the right direction, but they're not going to move in the right direction by thinking if we just take out this one government, if just only this country changes, everything will be fine. That's the game that has been played so far, and that's part of the reason why we're still here.
Well, and we have one example, Iraq, and Dr. Abbas can maybe tell us more about that. But also, over the past year, what strategies has Iraq implemented to avoid being drawn into the conflict between Iran and Israel? Have they been successful, do you think? I mean, with the militias right now launching attacks, do you think they have been successful with these strategies?
Well, thank you, Reema, and thank you to Dr. Dafer and to my friend Anas for organizing this great conference and having me on. And before 2003, Iraq was entangled in many conflicts, and the government of Saddam Hussein that was in charge of Iraq for over 20 years was the culprit in all of these. So Iraq was the problem seen in all of these conflicts that Iraq was entangled in. Post-2003 is completely different. It's the reverse. Almost all the entanglements of Iraq were not the doing of the Iraqi government, but mostly it was a result of regional conflicts. Iraq, in 90% of the time, is not even party to those conflicts. It was just a convenient battleground for some people who didn't want to fight directly, so they found a place to fight in Iraq. And part of it is really the development of this new notion of fighting by proxies, and that's convenient to nations that do not want to be, again, directly involved in conflict. The Iraqi government, in all of those years since 2003, was not even given a breathing room to finalize its institutions, especially the security forces. They were building a nation, and in the meanwhile, fighting to survive so many conflicts. And until now, we are the building of the state, the building of the institutions, the building of the security forces is a project in progress. It is unfinished business so far. The Iraqi capabilities now, defense or offense capabilities, are mainly restricted to domestic engagements. Iraq does not have the stomach, nor does the Iraqi government really want to engage in a conflict that would cross the borders of Iraq. The only probably stomach and also capabilities are in the hands of non-government actors, mainly the drones that are sent once in a while, or sometimes sending even fighters across the borders, as has happened in Syria and as it could happen elsewhere. So the government decided to change its posture from the pre-2003. They opened themselves, especially after 2015 probably. And it depends on how you view it. I personally view it that it's because many of Iraq's neighbors decided not to engage the new Iraqi government. Some of them did not even open an embassy in Baghdad, like Saudi Arabia, for example, until 2015, missing 12 years of possible engagement with Iraq and creating a vacuum for other actors to operate. And that's part of the legacy we are in. So the Iraqi government opened all of its relations opportunities. They have excellent relations now with the Gulf, almost all of the Gulf right now enjoys good relations with Iraq. They do work well with the United States, despite the differences of opinion on what Iraq is expected to do. They are trying to see, back to your question, is what they do. There isn't really much they can do. Because they are not party to the conflict, and they are just in the crossfire of two rivals, and Iraq is right there in between, geographically, politically, and in every aspect. The Iraqi bet right now is that for the United States probably to try to help Iraq avoid this conflict. I think Iraqi government's best prayer is that there is a solution for what we have been talking about all day long, a ceasefire, maybe with leadership from the United States, from Europe. Everybody gave up on the UN Security Council. They seem to be in a different world. But certainly, the countries that have vital interests in the region to find an end to this conflict before it expands and it catches Iraq. Some Iraqi groups who are fighting various conflicts, including some of their own, have engaged already, and we've seen drones sent towards Israel, and even there were some casualties. Until now, there is no retaliation. So again, there is not much for the Iraqi government to actively go and do more than work with everybody who is trying to find a solution to this conflict. Again, I go back to what Trita just said about Iraq's efforts to facilitate dialogue, which is the posture of Iraq in post-2003. They want to be the mediator. They enjoy the ability to talk to all parties. They talk to the Iranians as they talk to the Americans and the Saudis, and they have succeeded in facilitating some of these understandings, including the Saudi-Iranian rapprochement. And then that's one way, the dialogue that Trita just mentioned. Now there are talks between Prime Minister Mohammed Shah Sudani and President Macron and other people who are trying to get a possible conference or a forum to find understandings, and Iraq is heavily engaged in it. They seem to really be forcefully or forcibly believers in diplomacy, because that's the only tool in their hands, and to avoid a possibility of being dragged into the conflict militarily would be really disaster for Iraq.
Every answer, I feel, has opened up the floor for a million other questions. But we go back to Dr. Abu Bakr, and I do hope you can still hear us. I wanted to ask you, and you spoke briefly about the peace process in Yemen, but could you tell us more about how this rivalry between Iran and Israel impacted the peace process in Yemen, if it has or if it will?
Well, let me, if I may, diverge from this question a little at the beginning, because I want, and I'm sure many of you, especially our American friends, understand that in our part of the world, most people think that the United States of America is responsible for the situation we are in now. Maybe this is an oversimplification, but in reality, I think the defunct United Nations Security Council is the result of the vetoes of the United States and maybe other permanent members, where resolutions that could have contributed to resolving conflicts could have been made and implemented if there is a will to do so. So this is the first point. Second point, I think the Houthis in Yemen, when they're linked with Iran, is the result also of very inefficient governments that are unable to, in Yemen, I say, to rectify the legitimate rights of the members of the community in the country. And then they had to revolt against it or to take arms against the government, which led to wars. And this has resulted in the invitation of Iran to come into the conflict of Yemen. After this, of course, the proxy issue is all over the region, actually, and it has been for some time before even the recent conflicts, because of the concerns that every country has in trust in its neighbors. Regarding the dialogue between Iran and the region, I remember in 2010 there was an attempt by the Arab League to initiate a dialogue between the Arab League and Iran. At that time, of course, there were a lot of debate in the region about reforms, about change, which led eventually to the Arab Spring. And many of the Arab countries, especially the Gulf state countries, were opposed to initiating this dialogue between the Arab League or the Arab countries and Iran. Iran isolation, I think, has been also another factor for Iran's actually building these proxies, because it felt that this is going to be, if it's going to face everybody, then it has to prepare itself for all possibilities. So the management of the problem with Iran has been wrong for many years. And America, unfortunately, in dealing with the nuclear issue with Iran, has neglected that the peace really is by integrating Iran within the Arab in the region of GCC countries, especially trying to build a common national security strategy for the region and drawing the red lines for everybody so that we really have peace in the region. Of course, the Israeli issue is another dominant factor in all these conflicts, and in which also being taken advantage of by the proxies and by Iran. Now, how do we look at the situation now as far as Yemen and Iran is concerned? Iran's role, which could have been important to resolve the conflict in Yemen, has now unfortunately been dissipated, because the situation with the Palestinians in Lebanon have now changed the alliances and the posturing of each of the sides of the conflict. This means that the need now is really to ensure that an end to the war in Palestine and in Lebanon, and to start afresh with Americans and other countries in the region really reassessing their situation and their future relationship, and to build a permanent peace. Because Israel, even if it wins this war, it will not win peace, because the reasons for the conflict will remain with the Palestinians, unable to get their justice for a homeland and to gain their freedom. I believe now, I think there is a need really for very responsible leadership in both the Arab world and in Iran and in America, and those other countries who have influence on the conflict in the region. Otherwise, I think, unfortunately, we are going to move from this conflict, even if we moved out of it, to confront another conflict in the future.
Thank you. I go back to you, Dr. Lina. What can Lebanon do? What steps should, whether it's the government or the political parties of Lebanon, take to de-escalate the tension and work toward a ceasefire?
I mean, to de-escalate the tension, which tension? Between Hezbollah and Israel? unfortunately, the Lebanese state, as I said, has no say over what Hezbollah does. What they can do to de-escalate, I guess, social tension in Lebanon, which is another concern, domestic stability, as a result of the current situation, as you mentioned, 1.2 million Lebanese people, that's around a fifth of the population, has been displaced because of the current war. The situation is not yet at breaking point, thankfully, and doesn't need to deteriorate to that extent, but there is a risk that if this continues, with the state being basically bankrupt and unable to meet the needs of the displaced people, and with the majority of the displaced people coming from southern Lebanon, being mainly Shia Muslims on the streets, if winter comes, this is a recipe for social tension. And what the Lebanese leaders should do, at the very least, is get themselves together to resurrect the political process in Lebanon, because all this is happening against the backdrop of political vacuum in Lebanon. So Lebanon, at the very least, should get its internal house in order. There's still no president in Lebanon. There's only a caretaker government when the country is facing this really critical risk. So that should happen, and it's up to the Lebanese this time to actually take the initiative. And unfortunately, they are not. And I'm not surprised that they are not. I have very little hope, frankly, in the political elite that have been ruling Lebanon for decades, because they're not going to suddenly reform themselves, even when faced with this critical threat. So what should happen is sadly different from what will happen. But again, there is an opportunity here, I think, for the international community to be aware that, again, there is an international responsibility here. I remember in 2019, when protests were happening in Lebanon against the political system, I remember hearing dismissive statements across the board from policymakers in Europe and elsewhere about this, because, they're like, why should we even pay much attention to this, because the status quo in Lebanon is not going to change, and it's not worth us spending much time, on these new kind of political voices that are trying to break through. And I think this was incorrect as an approach to Lebanon, to kind of take the status quo for granted, has also allowed this political elite to feel comfortable in being complacent about the national interest, basically. So the Lebanese need to lead, the international community needs to support. Whether this will happen or not, as I said, I'm not very hopeful.
That's very sad to hear. David, has the balance of power between Iran and Israel shifted, and what potential impact could this have on Lebanon and on Yemen?
I think there's been a dramatic setback for two of Iran's leading regional proxies, absolutely. Putting aside, the humanitarian situations in Lebanon and Gaza, the proxies themselves have been degraded. I don't think there's any debate about that. Hassan Nasrallah, who was killed by Israel on September 27th, basically replaced Qasem Soleimani as the head of Iran's foreign legions. He was a senior advisor to, a trusted advisor. Hezbollah was key in training up all the other regional proxies. So nobody can debate that they have been set back. And not only that, this redounds to Iran's influence and their prestige and their threat. Actually, the purpose of Hezbollah, aside from dominating Lebanon, the purpose of Hezbollah wasn't to liberate territory from Israel. It was to protect Iran from an Israeli strike against the regime or against its nuclear program, right? They're no longer in a position to play that role. And so this is a weakening, certainly, of Iran's position. They are on their back leg, let's say. They are still, I think, extremely capable and can inflict damage on many countries in the region. We saw what happened when the Iranian foreign minister went to see Najib Mikati in Lebanon. You had to see the body language. There was a a language that McCarthy was threatened, essentially, from actually using this as an opportunity, the setback of Hezbollah, to rebalance the political system, as Lina was suggesting that there's an opportunity for. Don't take this opportunity. And of course, this particular proxy, had followed through on threats. I mean, it wasn't just assassinating Hariri, assassinating 18 other senior political officials and thought makers and leaders in the country, intellectuals, but also politicians. So whether this can be capitalized on is really an open question. How this plays out, what this means, listen, I think there will be, when this is all shakes out, there has been, well, before we get to the end, the Houthis have been a tremendous success for Iran. Low cost, high impact. Iran now controls the Straits of Hormuz and Bab el-Mandeb, the two key energy choke points in the region, some of the most important points of transit for the economy in the world. It's done this on the cheap, and the United States has not stepped up to play its traditional role in ensuring freedom of navigation. This is an issue. However, at the end of the day, whether this, how this shakes out for Iran, how it shakes out for Israel, it's to be determined. In Lebanon, I think there's an opportunity. In Gaza, nobody knows what the hell to do the day after. And there's still going to be hundreds of Hamas walking around with AK-47s that intimidate anybody who wants to rebuild. In Lebanon, too, there's still going to be 15,000 Hezbollahis with AK-47s threatening anyone who would dare supplant them. And the Houthis persist. The Hashid, I fear, just one last point on this, Iraq will be eventually targeted. They have been targeted before by Israel. Even before, I mean, let us not mistakenly understand what these militias are doing as a product necessarily of what's happening to the Palestinians in Gaza. Even well before, in 2018-19, Iran sent ballistic missiles to the Hashid, and they were storing them in warehouses in Iraq. And lo and behold, that summer, these warehouses started to blow up. Nobody knows why. Maybe it was bad air conditioning in the middle of the summer, or maybe somebody blew them up. They will be targeted eventually. They are sending drones consistently. And even before this conflict, they attacked Saudi Arabia with drones, the Hashid. So I think this is another point of regional instability. And notwithstanding Iraq's role or hope for a role in dialogue, it is the government that is funding the Hashid, $6.3 billion a year. So this is not just an Iranian problem, this is an Iraqi problem now.
Let's take it to Iraq. I mean, what David is saying is basically a recipe for a regional war, given that we also have a government in Israel that says we will not stop short, continuing their military campaign across the region. If a war were to break out, how might that impact Iraq's security situation, and what are the implications for the U.S. troops currently present in the country?
Well, that is exactly what the crux of the problem is. I mean, the Iraqis are hoping that the United States, that is in charge, niceties aside, it's the United States that is in charge of the defense of Iraq externally. The Iraqi government capabilities are all directed towards domestic threats, and there are so many of those. So the government is handling them very well. The Iraqi security forces were never tested on a cross-the-border conflict, and that is, if you don't count ISIS that came from Syria. But clearly, the current situation is set as the Iraqi security forces were to keep the internal security of Iraq. The government is not talking in terms of threats or in terms of making any posture that is a military readiness for war. There are a few things that might help. First of all, there is no direct border between Iraq and Israel. So we are not expecting a sort of military to military fight. If anything happens, it would be strike by either some air means, whether it's planes or drones or something like that, or missiles. So far, for the Israelis to strike Iraq, they have to go through the Americans. And the question is how much the United States has of leverage. Speaking of U.S. leverage in the past maybe weeks, if not months, we don't see a demonstrable ability by the current administration that they are willing or even practicing any leadership in this conflict. And that's one of the biggest problems that are letting this conflict go to scary levels. But the question here with Iraq is there is no way out of it. The United States is in charge of what happens to Iraq, even though, on paper, it's a completely different story. Here, the government is talking with the only tool in its toolkit, which is diplomacy, talking to everybody, and sending messages that Iraq, as a government, the official Iraq, is not interested in conflict or in participating in it. But there are other groups that have weapons, and again, David referred to the Hashd. I think we need to be sort of more nuanced when we talk about it. The Hashd is not a monolith.
76 groups.
There are all these groups, and maybe 2 or 3 groups out of those 70 that are considered to be a trouble for the Iraqi government and for the region. But everybody else is doing what the Iraqi government is trying to put them to, which is help in the defense of the domestic front of Iraq, and they don't engage in any fights against anybody. So the money that goes to the Hashd is not, as many people think, it is going to finance these activities. But these groups that are engaged in extracurricular activities, if you were to put it this way, in terms of their relation with the government, these people do have a mind of their own, a work of their own. Some of their work is in coordination with the Iraqi government, some is not. And when this is happening, actually, if you listen to them, they did make it clear that if Iraq is targeted by Israel, or if they are targeted by Israel, then the U.S. interests in the region will be targeted by them. That's, they are not making a secret of it. And that's why, again, once that happens, I hope it doesn't, but if it does, then we will be watching a different dynamic altogether than what we have right now. I can tell you that the Iraqi government is not going to control their activities, and certainly probably even U.S. capabilities of trying to protect U.S. assets is going to be very limited. So let's hope that we go back to the classic way of thinking about eliminating the damage from a conflict like this, is to prevent its escalation to begin with, rather than thinking about controlling its consequences, because no one, in my opinion, will be able to control the consequences of an escalated conflict in the Middle East. It is terrible as it is, and I think if people drop the ball on just look the other way, sleep on the switch, then basically it will be too late to do anything in terms of damage control.
Dr. Trita, a lot to answer with all of the questions that are being posed, and I have more questions, but let me ask you this question before posing all of these questions. In the event of further escalation, more tension, leading up to an all-out war in the region, how do you foresee Iran adjusting its regional strategy, whether it's in Iraq or Yemen or Syria or Lebanon?
Thank you. First of all, I do fear that further escalation is inevitable at this point. And I think the administration's line that they have managed to convince the Israelis to only strike military targets is most likely going to be somewhat meaningless, because the Israelis are likely going to strike military targets and military individuals, meaning going after senior officials in the IRGC. That will next to guarantee that the Iranians will respond. And they have already shown that they have the capacity of penetrating Israel's very advanced missile defense system. There would not be a need for sending THAAD batteries to Israel if the Israeli performance there had been sufficient. This means that in the second iteration of this, the idea that the Israelis would continue to only restrain themselves to military targets instead of going after nuclear sites, economic infrastructure, is very unlikely. And at that point, this will escalate beyond. So the first step in this escalatory cycle is not necessarily particularly important, as long as it's an escalatory cycle. It's where it ends up. And after that, it's really impossible to be able to say where things will go. I think David was right in saying that, we in some ways will have to see how it unfolds. I do think, however, that you're already starting to see some patterns that indicate that the Iranians are doing essentially a tactical retreat when it comes to some of these groups that they're supporting. Meaning going back to where they were 20 or so years ago, in which they were operating not as openly, more asymmetrically than they were before, whether that means in the same locality, whether that means to regroup in Syria or other places. The idea, however, that this is some sort of an end of the fight, in the manner in which we hear some hubris, whether it's in Tel Aviv or whether it's in Washington, I find extremely unlikely. Far more likely is that this is the beginning of a much longer war that will leave very few places in the region, very few actors in the region untouched.
Just a reminder that if you have questions, you can pass them along write them on the cards. And I already have two. I think the first one will go to Dr. Al-Qirbi about Yemen. How do other actors in the Yemen war, like the SDC or AQAB, impact the regional power dynamic?
Well, as you know, these two are part of the Yemeni Presidential Council. And most of these groups, unfortunately, are influenced by their sponsors, whether it is the Emirates or Saudi Arabia. And their impact on the conflict will depend on what is, in the end, the coalition's role in escalating the war in Yemen or not.
Okay, that was fast. I did not expect that. This is a question, I don't have the name, but I think it's more of a critique to panelists gave an impression that Iraq is just a bystander in this conflict, but it has actually allowed military, willingly, thousands of them, Iraqi militias, to go to Syria.
I guess that will fall in my lap. Look, the Iraqi government has tackled this question, Reema. It's not a new question. I don't mean to criticize the question, but I just want to know that what I'm going to tell you is the debate that has been going on for a while. In fact, the first person who answered this question was Prime Minister Haider Abadi, who was the prime minister in Iraq from 2014 to 2018. And when he was asked about the fighters that went to Syria, he said, we don't finance them, we did not send them, we do not equip them. If you were to hold us accountable for them and for their fight in Syria, hold the French accountable for their guys who are fighting in Syria, hold the Americans accountable, hold the Russians, hold the Chechens, hold everybody who has all these people who have their citizens going and fighting there doing it. It's not that the Iraqi government is sending them to fight. That's one really way the Iraqi government talks about it and how they look at it, and that has been the same answer from every government. As far as the Iraqi government itself, yes, I do believe that they are the innocent bystander in this, because no country has been targeted by external meddling and external interference in their own affairs after 2003 than Iraq, and had to deal with it than the Iraqi government. Iraq has, as a government, as official policy, as official security forces, they have never been interfering on or conducting activities or funding any work that would go to any country. But if you look at it, Turkey has troops in Iraq, and they are destabilizing the north. Iran has interference in Iraq with all kinds of what we've been talking about. Saudi Arabia had for a long time Syria itself, in various ways, before Syria had become a sort of Assad became bad actor, he was working hand in hand with people who were trying to destabilize Iraq. And all of that seems to be, somehow Iraq has survived all of this. But at the end of the day, I think to get those regional conflicts and blame them on the government of Iraq, I think it is inaccurate and it's unfair. I'm not a spokesperson for the Iraqi government, but again, the way we see it, the way we closely monitor it, I think it's not, this is not Saddam Hussein's government. This is a government that tried and has done everything that it is expected to do, and even more, to be able to flip or turn the page on all of these conflicts, and opened itself for all those who were willing to work with Iraq and with the Iraqi government, and even with countries that have been, having different policies. And we've seen Iraqi government, after Iraqi government has been talking openly about this meddling, they were willing to turn the chapter and work with everybody. And I think the best example is the Iraqi relations with the Gulf today. We have excellent relations with the Gulf. Compare that with, before 2015, where, so it is, again, it is a tough position. It's unenviable to be in the position of the Iraqi government to deal with these conflicts. But I would say it with all clarity and unequivocally that the Iraqi government has not been the troublemaker in the region.
Can I
actually have two questions for you.
Oh.
Did you want to comment
Well,
on that?
I was just going to make a point. I know that the government of Iraq is in a very difficult position, and yet, there are these component groups of the Hashid that are out there freelancing and targeting Americans and killing other Iraqi civilians and intimidating, and high level of corruption. And it's like the government of Iraq says that we can't do anything, we're weak, it's dangerous, we can't do it. It's a parallel thing in Lebanon, where the government of Lebanon says, well, you have to understand it's an Iran problem, Hezbollah is 10 feet tall, and we can't do anything, and it's not our problem. And yet they're signing on to Bayan Mazari that says that the weapons of the Muqawama are legitimate, right? At the same time, they say, oh, well, it's not our problem, we can't do anything, give us international aid, right? Help us. Come save us from ISIS, but get out of here, and we're not going to do anything when these groups that we're paying for target you.
Well, I mean, again, if I may just,
Am I being too tough?
No, you are
We're
making a good
spicing it
point
up
here.
now.
The question here is this. One Iraqi prime minister said it here in Washington when he was asked. He said, look, I have so many fronts, and there are certain fronts that I am not eager and I'm not ready to open. Yeah. He actually was asked about it, and he gave the answer in terms of, why are you leaving the Turks in the north? Yeah. He said, look, I'm fighting ISIS. I am fighting criminal organized crime in Iraq. I'm fighting all tribal weapons. I'm fighting. I don't have the means and abilities to go and open
Another front.
another front against the Turks. I am not able to go and send my security forces to fight with 100,000 Iraqi armed groups that are, that are going to, why would I open a civil war at this point? And especially where these people are, in one way they are creating trouble spot, in another way they are helping the Iraqi government in holding land and in fighting ISIS and fighting others. It's the same. This is the same problem. As I said, the Iraqi government has been in a position, and if you go to the genesis of this, is why? Why do we have these groups to begin with? Is because
ISIS.
when we left, we did not give Iraq an army that was capable of holding its ground. And the reason why the military that was given to Iraq when the United States left was not much of a military. And that's why when they melted away, we ended up with those groups, because it was the only line of defense between ISIS and cutting the throats of hundreds of thousands of Iraqis. They did, but at least they did not do all the job that was intended for them to do. And this is something. I was at the Naval Postgraduate School, and I was in charge of a project. The U.S. finally decided to go and work on and give Iraqis logistical capabilities in 2010. In 2010, until that moment, Iraqis did not have even training on logistics. And you know what they say about logistics? They don't win wars, but they can single-handedly lose wars. There is no interoperability. There was no Iraqi military at all. Why? Because the plan was that Iraq and the United States will renew the 2008 SOFA, the Status of Forces Agreement, and then when it did not, then the whole plan fell apart, and we ended up with Iraq left to its own devices. After 2011, all of the groups that we talk about that were before, they dropped their arms, and no shot was fired from them between 2011 until 2014, when ISIS took over and when there was nobody to stop them except for those groups. Accountability can go all the way on 360 degrees, but I don't think that the Iraqi government is what we should think about first when we try to assign culpability. They are in an unenviable position.
And I think that is a subject that can take hours. I do have two questions for you. I'm going to ask them quickly and briefly, but I do want to end with one question for Trita and one question for you. So if we can get the answers. Do you agree that Israelis' withdrawal from the West Bank and Gaza and a two-state solution will bring us on a road to peace? That is the first question. And I'm going to ask you briefly the other one, and maybe you can incorporate. The other one is about Lebanon. What do you think is a good governance system in Lebanon? The day after, do you support the Lebanese call for a federation? I think federalism.
Yeah, federalism.
Peace, yes, with Israel.
Well, solve the Arab-Israeli conflict on one foot.
Can you in like 2 minutes?
Yeah. Listen, it depends, right? But what's going to be there when Israel pulls out, right? I personally do believe in two-state solution. For what it's worth. Whether that's achievable now, we'll kick the can down the road on that, but there's got to be a political horizon. And in any event, what's going to govern? And is it going to be seen as legitimate by Palestinian? And is it going to want to have peace with its neighbor? I think this is going to take a long time. There's too many raw feelings after October 7th and the year that's happened right now. Lebanon, listen, I don't believe in dividing Iraq into three. I don't believe in dividing Lebanon into 10 or 17 different parts. This is a very small country. And for federalism, you have to, like Switzerland, you have to agree in a common principle. And there is not that common principle that all Lebanese agree. And so I don't think it can work. The other thing is that one part of the country pays all the taxes. And the other parts of the country don't generate any revenues. So it's not going to work. But what the calls for federalism are recognition that what we have right now is not working, and people want something that actually works.
Trita, this tit for tat between Israel and Iran, what some would see as tit for tat, none of the parties have taken it to an extreme response or retaliation until now. Is that because there is a legitimate fear that anything could push Iran closer to a nuclear weapon? Is that the calculation, do you think? And what prevents Iran from acquiring that, given what's going on?
So I do think that that is part of the concern of the administration. Part of the reason they also don't want the Israelis to target the nuclear sites, because it would provide the Iranians with a pretext to not only walk out of whatever remains of the JCPOA, but of the entire NPT, invoking Article 10. I don't think that is what is preventing the Israelis from doing it. What's preventing the Israelis is that they don't have the green light from the United States, because that's an operation that would require American involvement beyond what we have seen so far. But from the Israeli side, if they did have the support of the United States, I don't think that they would be hesitating. Their strategy, as we have seen, as we see now in Gaza, what we're seeing in Lebanon, is essentially mowing the grass, but on a much larger scale. Not to think that there actually is a real solution towards getting rid of the program, but if you need to bomb it every 5 or 6 years, that's what you do. So I've not seen anything from the Israelis that suggests anything more sophisticated than that. The real risk here now, of course, is that the narrative and the discourse in Iran is changing very, very dramatically in favor, not in the sense that there's a majority yet, but certainly you can definitely see a rise of voices that are making the argument, first carefully, saying that the nuclear doctrine, as manifested in Khamenei's fatwa, needs to be reassessed. There are people inside the government who were in favor of the JCPOA, who are essentially seeing Khamenei as the obstacle for weaponization because of his fatwa. You're seeing a situation in which, particularly mindful of the fact that Israel is engaging in what essentially cannot be described as anything else but a genocide. And you have Western states, not just the United States, approving it, supporting it. You had the German foreign minister in her feminist foreign policy justifying it and making an argument that there are no such things as civilian spaces in a war zone if terrorists use them. All of these different things together is hardening the Iranian position. The question, of course, is, thanks to the JCPOA, the West had a tremendous amount of insight into the program. Trump walked out of it. There's a degree of darkness now that we didn't have in 2015 and 2016. What has happened in that area of darkness is remaining unknown. But if there's one thing that is clear, the desire to move towards weaponization, which I don't think at all, contrary to what people in Washington thought, was solid before. I don't think they would have done the JCPOA if they actually wanted to get a bomb. That desire, the sense of a need for a nuclear deterrence is there in a way that wasn't the case 10 years ago.
Lina, you talked about the need for Washington to do more. You talk to the left, they criticize Washington for doing too much sometimes. You talk to the right, they criticize Washington for not doing enough. Washington, however, is a 4-year cycle, half of which is campaigning for the elections. What do you think? Do you think they're able really to do anything in the region? Do you think there is the stamina, there is the will, there is, or is it just too self-centered at this point domestically?
Okay, well, first of all, this is a region that you ignore at your peril, as we're all vividly seeing these days. Second, the cost of inaction is as consequential as the cost of action. And I mean, I'm British. In the UK, I'm not talking about Washington, but in the UK, I hear this a lot about Syria. Oh, look what happened in Iraq. So had we actually intervened in Syria, we would have ended up in this kind of scenario. So, but Iraq is not Syria. And so I hear all kinds of excuses, you know, justifying inaction. And this inaction, as I said, ends up being consequential and ends up eventually not being in the national interest. So when it comes to the US, I think putting the Middle East on kind of the bottom rank of, the list of foreign policy priorities is now coming to bite us all in the back. And I don't think this is sustainable. So I'm hoping that at least the next US administration can reflect and learn from the mistakes of the administrations over the past decade and a half.
Well, thank you everyone with this week and this very informative, diverse, definitely interesting discussion. With us was Dr. Abu Bakr Al-Qirbi, former Minister of Foreign Affairs for the Republic of Yemen, member of the Advisory Board of the Gulf International Forum, Dr. Lina Khatib, Director, SOAS, Middle East Institute, David Schenker, Taube, Senior Fellow and Director of the Linda and Tony Rubin Program on Arab Politics, Washington Institute for Near East Policy, and Dr. Trita Parsi, Executive Vice President, the Quincy Institute, and Dr. Abbas, Kadhim, Director of Iraq Initiative and Senior Fellow of the Middle East Program, the Atlantic Council. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.